join in the next few minutes.
Yeah, that sounds good. All right, well, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Ursula Sansom-Daly. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of New South Wales and also a clinical psychologist at Sydney Youth Cancer Service. And I want to start today by thanking each of our wonderful panellists for joining us. We're so grateful, and we'll do proper introductions in a moment, as well as Dr. Joe Shaw, Bonnie Laxton-Blinkhorn, and the PoCoG executive for really getting behind this event, and my brilliant ECR special interest group co-chairs, Dr. Camille Short and Dr. Gemma Satkowski, for their hard work in coordinating this event too. And I also want to really begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of all the many lands that we're meeting on today. And specifically, I'd like to show my respects and acknowledge the Bedegal people, who are the traditional custodians of the land where I am, of elders past, present and emerging, where this meeting takes place, and frankly, where guidance from more senior, cherished mentors has also been taking place for tens and thousands of years. So I'm going to set the scene a little bit for us today as an ECR myself, and I'll start by stating the obvious, which is, I don't know about you all, but I feel like the last few months have been pretty intense, and I think words like unprecedented, extraordinary, stressful, all the things that media has used to describe it and more. And we've really collectively lived through a huge sense of urgency and panic, not only about the public health threat going on around us, but also in our jobs. So some of us may have had to pause or stop studies due to not being able to undertake face-to-face recruitment or interventions. Conferences and other work trips and visits have been cancelled. Clinicians may have had extra pressures from stressed out patients, as well as stressed out colleagues trying to master new telehealth skills. And not to mention many of us or some of us trying to undertake the humanly impossible task, which is to work well from home with toddlers and preschoolers around, or suddenly trying to become a homeschooling principal extraordinaire. So in reality, this means that many ECRs have had to effectively maybe stop working altogether, or at a far reduced capacity and productivity. So now we're in this place where there is a new sense of relative calm as our COVID-19 situation has settled down considerably. And in Australia, we have been so lucky not to experience the absolute unmitigated horror that unfolded in places like Italy, the UK and the US. Yet I think it is still fair to say that as a community, we are still largely on some level of high alert. We're still physically distancing, we're still working from home, we're still getting updates about COVID-19 cases, and we're all still getting tested, importantly, as we should do at the slightest hint of a sniffle. And those of us working in universities are also likely aware of the regular updates foreshadowing the sort of job losses that, might lie just around the corner as the financial impact starts to be truly felt in the tertiary sector. So I think for ECRs in particular, this leaves us in a really weird limbo right now. There's both a feeling of anticlimax, a feeling all sort of disoriented and lost, a bit like you've just gotten off a rocky boat after emerging from a terrible storm, and a sense in which we're still on guard and waiting. And from a professional perspective, we now have a bit more space and perhaps energy to grapple with what's on our plates in terms of studies, grants, deliverables, and that kind of thing. But many of us still find ourselves feeling sort of frozen and paralysed in the middle of this. So wearing my clinical psychologist hat for a moment, I do think many of us are still in the midst of our fight or flight response, which is after all so natural when our lives and our livelihoods are threatened. But when you're scared, you're tunnel vision, you're ready to spot catastrophes in an instant, it's really not a great headspace to be thinking creatively, to be dreaming up study ideas, writing beautiful and impactful grants and papers, or, developing your future research vision. So today's webinar is all about our ECR community getting some sage advice, reassurance perhaps, and wayfinding tips from some amazing leaders in our field. And of course, none of us have had to grapple with the COVID-19 pandemic before. So our panelists have likely been grappling with some new problems at the very same time as we have. But what we're hoping for today is that our guest panelists will be able to draw from the experiences gained over the course of their successful and vast research careers to help us ECRs slow down, zoom out, pause, and perhaps consider our options in ways that will be helpful to our current and our future careers. There's a lovely poem doing the rounds about COVID-19 that has a really powerful line that I think is useful for us to remember, which is that we're all going through the same storm, but we aren't all in the same boat. So just in that same way, I hope today will be useful no matter what your personal or professional situation. Please don't be shy to ask questions on the chat, and we really hope that we'll keep the conversation going after today as well with the hashtag PoCoG_ACR. So there's no silly questions at all. If you're thinking it, chances are another ECR is too. So I want to finish by again extending my huge thanks to our panelists for generously sharing their time and thoughts with us today. So how this is going to work is our panelists will now start by each spending a couple of minutes sharing their top tip from remaining resilient in the current environment, after which we're going to have a panel discussion to dive in a bit deeper. So without further ado, I'm now going to hand over to my ECR fellow co-chair, Dr. Gemma Skachkovsky, to introduce our panelists.
Hey, thanks, Ursula. And thanks for so clearly articulating the issues that led to today's webinar. So I'm going to start off today by introducing everyone, but just before I do, I'd like to just give a little bit of a housekeeping tip about how we're taking questions today. So there's a chat function in Zoom. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, if you can type those in, we will be moderating those and we will give them to the panelists to answer at a later point. Most of the questions will be shifted towards the back end of the webinar, but please do send them through if you have things that you'd like to ask. Also, more generally, if you would like to tweet about the event, the hashtag that we're using for today's event is PoCoG_ECR. So I'll start off with some brief introductions. I do apologise for how brief these are. There were many wonderful things I could say about our lovely panellists, but I'm limited with time. So I'll start off with Professor Afa Gerges, who is the Director of the Psycho-oncology Research Group at the Ingham Institute for Applied Medical Research at UNSW. She has worked for more than 30 years as a behavioural scientist in cancer control and psycho-oncology and has received numerous awards for her work. In 2019, she became a member of the Order of Australia for significant service in cancer control and psycho-oncology. Professor Gerges is committed to training junior researchers to become our future workforce and works closely with clinicians and cancer centres to translate research findings into practice. Next up, we have Associate Professor Inga Mewburn, who is the Director of Research Training at ANU. She is a research educator with an interest in research student experiences, post-PhD employability, and in helping PhD students and ECRs to reach their potential. She created the extremely popular Thesis Whisperer blog, which I'm sure everyone has heard of, which has had well over 4 million hits in the last 5 years and has 60,000 followers. Associate Professor Liz New is from the School of Chemistry at the University of Sydney. Her research involves the development of small molecule imaging agents for use in biology, and last year she won the Prime Minister's Malcolm McIntosh Prize for Physical Scientist of the Year. She was the founding co-chair of the University of Sydney Early Mid-Career Academic Network, or SEMCAM, which aims to support ECRs in their career development and to make strategic and informed decisions about their career trajectory and goals. Last, but certainly not least, we have Professor Claire Wakefield, who is the Director of the Behavioural Sciences Unit at the Kids Cancer Centre at Sydney Children's Hospital, a Professor at UNSW, and co-director of the National Initiative Kids to Adults, K2A, Chronic Illness Alliance. Professor Wakefield's research aims to explore how best to meet the needs of families affected by paediatric and adolescent cancer through cost-effective interventions and translational work to create change in clinical practice. She's published more than 190 journal articles and is named as Chief Investigator on competitive research grants totalling more than 37 million. So, once again, I'd like to thank our panel members for taking the time today to speak to us. What I will do is move on to the Spilling the Beans section, where we're going to get our panel members to give us their top tip for resilience and overcoming challenges. So I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that. Yep, I'm getting some nods. Okay, great. So this will work as kind of a rapid fire session. I'm going to get each panelist to tell us their top tip and then explain it a little bit. Everyone has about 1 to 2 minutes to do this. We will save questions until a later point, but if you do have them, please send them through on the chat function. So Afa, I'll start off with you. What is your top tip?
Hey, thanks everyone. I put this one up because I think this is one of the key things that I've found with our team, particularly in the whole COVID-19 situation. So staying connected with people, or if you weren't connected before, then find a way of getting connected with people. And particularly thinking about not just connected from an academic point of view, but from a social point of view as well. I think everyone would agree that working as an island can be quite isolating, it can be quite lonely, but it can also be quite damaging to mental health and job performance. And what I mean by that is that, you know, like an example of getting connected or staying connected is while we've been working from home over the last 2.5 months or so, we decided right at the very beginning for my team of about 10 or so people that every Wednesday and Friday we would have just a brief lunchtime catch up over Zoom so that we can just have a social catch up, what's everybody up to, etc. You know, I've been used to working from home for many, many, many years, but for a lot of people that was their first experience of being completely isolated, not necessarily having someone at home during the whole workday. So that felt quite isolating to people. But I think the other aspect of that, so that's the kind of social aspect, but I think from a professional aspect, staying connected with people is critically important because you could be stewing over something while you're working in an isolated sort of environment and thinking, I can't believe how long it's taking me to do this when I've got no other interruptions, etc. I know quite a few on screen have got lots of other interruptions, small children being a key factor there. But, you know, the idea that you can be sitting at home stewing thinking, I wonder how everyone else is progressing, they must be doing more than I'm able to achieve, etc., can be quite damaging because, you know, people are all in the same kind of having a similar experience, or some might be doing a little bit better and you want to know what's working for them that you can implement to work more efficiently, etc. So that's really what I mean by not working as an island. Oh, you can hear some of my noise, can you? Apologies, everyone. I've got renovations happening downstairs. I'll mute when I'm not talking. Yeah, so really thinking about who are you connected with currently, maintain or strengthen those connections. And if you don't feel terribly well connected, try and, you know, make a few connections through other people introducing you to a network, for example, or a social kind of setting or a work setting, etc. And I can talk a little bit more about that in the question session, but maybe for the moment, I'll stop at that.
Okay. Thanks very much, Afa. That's really interesting tips. I think in the interest of time, we'll move straight along to the next top tip, and that is from Inga.
I think by now I'd learned to unmute my mic. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. It's extremely intimidating to talk about resilience amongst a bunch of psychologists when one has background in architecture, which is a profession that needs a lot of resilience, but still. I've just put on my slide, the thing that's always helped me in my career is comparing yourself to other people is always a path to just self-doubt, shame spirals, all sorts of unhelpful thinking activities, which I'm sure you all know. I suppose what I spend time talking about, because what's on the slide there is, you know, myself as a researcher, how have I then tried to enact resilience in my life? So we're living in extraordinary times, and anxieties that we normally can push to the back of our mind suddenly become front of mind. Security, housing, food, all these things are suddenly ever present. Now, in an academic and an early career researcher sense, we've known that the job market is precarious and has been for years and years. And the question now is this business as usual but more extreme, or is it completely broken? We do know that 38% of our research funding is dependent on international student income. There's promising early signs that this demand is still strong. So if we can get them on shore, I think we're going to be fine. However, it does create this atmosphere of uncertainty. So I suppose the first question I ask myself, my research portion of my job, I concentrate on post-PhD employability. I think it's the biggest, most extreme issue in my field. And the first thing I ask myself as a researcher is, what can I do now to help people? How can I reach out in my circle of influence, my circle of concern, to offer what I know and what I can do to support others in my community? And that outward focus, I think, building on the previous speaker's slide of not being an island, has really helped my own resilience. So for 3 years, I've been working on a project analysing job ads using machine learning. What I'm trying to do there is find the hidden job market for PhD students outside academia. So luckily for me, this has immediate and quite pressing applications in the world that we're living in. We did actually launch a product that we expected universities to be able to buy. It's a search engine for researchers looking for non-academic employment. In February, just as universities slammed down the door and said, we're not buying a single thing forever for about 5 years. So that's created a huge amount of disruption. So what I've just concentrated on instead is just continuing to share my research findings as I develop them with the user groups that are concerned, which is including you, which is why I took up this, this offer today to talk to you. So just staying engaged and thinking about where your research is useful and keeping your mind on that can be just a way, I think, of pushing anxieties to the back. So love to all in this time, recognising that taking your time out for your own self-care and to reach out to others in a webinar like this is a really good move to start off with. So I'm going to be quiet now and go back to being on Twitter. So I'm happy to have a chat with people on Twitter or in the chat box as the other speakers speak. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Inga. I'll move on to Liz.
Yes, so my piece of advice for ECRs always, and for anyone really, is to never stop asking for advice. Never stop talking to other people. I know we've already heard about this, but I do really want to emphasize the asking for advice side of this. I think I spent far too long when I was starting out my career sitting in my office not knowing the answers to questions and sort of thinking that people might come and tell me the answers. The fact is that academics are immensely generous with their time, but not necessarily very thoughtful in offering it. And so what I really found was as soon as I got the confidence to go and ask people for advice, they were more than willing to give me the answers, give me advice, share their experiences with me. And that was really invaluable. And that, of course, is never more important than it is now. But also probably it's harder now than it ever has been before. It's harder. You can't just bump into someone. You can't just invite someone for coffee in a way that you could in the past. But I do really want to stress, I think it's really important. You'll almost never be knocked back. If you ask someone for advice, if you ask someone if you can have a 15-minute Zoom chat, they're more than likely to say yes and to give you the best advice that they can. And again, people don't have all the answers at this difficult time. But it's certainly really important that you go out and seek it. I think one of the challenges of ECRs is to say that no one's helping them, no one's giving them mentorship, but there needs to be a certain element of really going out and looking for it and asking. Because as I say, lots of professors just don't tend to be very thoughtful and don't tend to see the people around them who are struggling. And so they need to get that prod and they'll really need to get it from you.
Thank you very much. It's really practical advice. And finally, we will just go to Claire.
Yeah, thanks. Those were fantastic already. The panelists are much more impressive than me, but I'll add my 2 cents worth as well. So my first suggestion was to really be patient at the moment. So I think reflecting on my own experience, for example, I was keeping this kind of crazy pace of meetings, conferences, out a lot, meeting lots of people. And that being that busy felt like I was being really productive. And then when I started working from home all the time, it felt really strange because everything just felt like it slowed down to nothing. And I think that actually that was a real blessing because things take longer than you think, and they always do. And I think particularly at the moment, it's taking time to get things done because you have to send an email, wait for them to reply, and then you send a reply. So things take longer, but I think that that's actually a really good thing because what it might do for you is to add up, to open up little spaces for thinking. And I've certainly found that really valuable. The thing that I've been thinking about is thinking ahead. So trying not to be too reactive in terms of say for my research, you know, what's been the impact on families right now? I've been thinking more about what's the long-term impact on families and how can I research that, for example. So trying to use the skills that I have already and the expertise that I have to try and think about what's it going to be like for families in 1 to 2 years. And then if I can kind of think about that ahead of time, then I might be a little bit ahead of the curve. And actually Australia might be really well placed to do that because we are sort of ahead of, hopefully ahead of other countries in terms of looking at recovery and planning for second wave, for example. The things I thought in terms of thinking ahead would be to think about things like in your field, what are the future gaps that you might see? What things, for example, an obvious one might be there might be more of a reliance on telehealth. Is that something that you could upskill on at the moment while you have a little bit of time so that you're well placed when new grants come, when new priorities are set by the government, that you're kind of well placed to take advantage of that? And then the other thing is really about relationships. And so relationships, I think, has been mentioned a few times, but it's really important to continue to build relationships. My personal experience that's been interesting is that I'm really lucky that my office is right across the hall from all the oncologists in our centre. And I've probably not been grateful enough for that, because being away from the office, I found I've had to think, I haven't seen them for weeks. I need to actually send them an email and say, how are you going? I need to just suggest, you know, pop up on a Zoom and wave, because you're missing that kind of, impromptu kind of water cooler conversations. So that's my focus at the moment, is which relationships are really important to me and how can I continue to build them so that when I go back to the office, I can pick up those relationships where they left off.
Thank you very much, Claire. And thank you to all of our panelists for all that advice. It's nice to see all the different pieces of advice that you get, but also the underlying themes of, you know, taking care of your mental health, reaching out to your network, and, you know, keeping in contact with people. I think that's really valuable advice, and there's some really good practical tips in there. So I'm just going to stop screen sharing. Back to panel. Okay, great. And I will hand over to Ursula, who's going to do the facilitated panel discussion.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you so much for those tips already, and that's already set the scene for some of the really important things for us to be thinking about. Now, I've got a number of questions that we're going to pose to our panelists, but I'm also really open to anyone attending. If you have burning questions, feel free to start feeding those in through the chat, and I'll try and keep my eye on that. But I suppose, so these are fantastic thoughts around the ways in which we need to be kind of stopping and thinking ahead and maintaining relationships. But I just want to get a bit practical for a moment before we do zoom out to research visions and things, and thinking about the ECR, and I can probably feel a little bit in this category as well. So the ECR who's kind of just getting through COVID and sort of maybe grappling with studies that maybe haven't been recruiting as well during the last couple of months, or maybe at all, because face-to-face recruitment or interventions have been stopped or put on hold. Or, you know, perhaps they've just had to stop work altogether due to, you know, other commitments at home. So I wonder if I could handball this one to Claire at the outset, but keen to hear from other panelists as well. What is your advice about some considerations that ECRs should sort of bear in mind in terms of deciding what to do with projects that, you know, might be on hold or might not be meeting their milestones the way you thought, might not be on track, or, you know, we've got options, I suppose. You could pause, you could close down and write up with a smaller sample, divert your focus, add new questions. Do you have advice about how we, you know, make our way through this maze of decision making?
Good question, Ursula. And I'm certainly not a world expert, but I'll have a go at adding to the suggestions you've already made there, Ursula. So I think that one of the things I think that's interesting is, although we all often have PhDs and these amazing academic careers, one thing that we don't have a lot of training in is project management. And some of the basics of project management are actually around assessing the risks to your project. No one could have ever foreseen COVID-19, but some of the principles around project management, around what happens if a project is derailed, what will you do, I think are quite useful. What I would think is, for each study, rather than trying to kind of hold them all and push them all forward at the same time, if that's causing you distress, I would probably recommend prioritization. And so look at each study really objectively and think, what can I do on this study at the moment? If it really genuinely is nothing, then be okay with that and prioritize something else. So you might be able to get another project done and finished or ahead of its schedule so that you've got time later to come back to those projects. So I think prioritization would be my first suggestion. The other suggestion I would make is to stay focused on just at least a couple of things. So keep your eye on the prize. So obviously this has been a really turbulent time, but my hope is that we're going to get back to all of our usual work. And I think it's really important to think about focusing on your key deliverables that you promised your granting bodies and delivering them if you can in some way. So don't kind of chase every single COVID project, every single potential grant, every single virtual conference. Try and stay focused on what you planned at the beginning. And then my third suggestion is around communication. And so I would be really open with funders and with your colleagues and people who are recruiting for you, other stakeholders in the project. I'd be really proactive there and let them know what the likely impacts are going to be and potentially get their advice about how to manage that. I, for example, for my program, wrote to our funders straight away and said, I think we're going to have a 6-month delay for this project, this project, this project. And I think they appreciated that. Apparently we were the first to have already got that plan together. But I think it's better to be open and upfront rather than try and hide it and try and pretend it didn't happen and then try and meet your original milestones. I'd re-plan your milestones to what is feasible and get support from the stakeholders and the funders for the new milestones that you're planning.
That's fantastic advice. Now, I want to say for the other panelists, please feel free to kind of put up your hand or jump in if you have something you want to add. Otherwise, I'll try and kind of direct it as well. Afa, I'm wondering if you had anything to add there, because I'm thinking about a lot of your projects, which are very, very clinically focused projects, very much integrated into the health system. And I can't help but wonder if you would have had experiences, with COVID or other times where sort of stuff going on like this is impacting meeting of milestones and things like that. Do you have advice on that?
Yeah, so a couple of comments. One, I just want to reinforce what Claire said about the going back to the funders and requesting extension of time. We are not the only ones doing this. So I'm working with a group at the moment that haven't gone back to their funders despite the funders having offered extensions to different groups. And I said to them, look, even if you end up not needing it, just go and ask them for it. You've got it as a backup plan. If you don't use the time or you only use a month of the time that you've asked for, it just gives you a little bit more flexibility, takes the stress away, and you're not the only one that's asking for it. So I would really strongly reinforce that. The other thing is around, all of the clinical work that we're doing, and we actually have a PhD student at the moment, Marina Wu, who was going to be recruiting non-English speaking participants, Chinese participants from clinical settings for a second part of her PhD. And obviously, sorry, can you hear all that noise? My apologies. It just becomes background noise after a little while. So, Verena, we've had to really rethink, well, what do we do now? Because she's at that point of her PhD where she needs to be recruiting participants. So we were going to be doing a small pilot controlled trial. Now, realistically, that just isn't going to happen. We don't actually know when we can start recruiting participants again from clinical settings. So stepping back from that and thinking, okay, well, what can we do to adapt the study to the situation that's at hand, and can we actually reduce the numbers that we need so by the time we're able to get into clinics again, we can have time to recruit those numbers but add on some qualitative work that could be done to complement that. So not doing away with the study or changing it completely, but really thinking about what can I adapt and what can I salvage, what's possible to extend onto to make that situation feasible and the study still feasible. Sometimes particularly in the clinical setting, a lot of clinicians have been redirected over the last couple of months to COVID activities. So they haven't had the headspace to kind of think about our research either. So again, just trying to think, well, what could we do in the meantime? Are there other activities that we could do that we might have not had time to do? Can we bring them forward so that when the time comes again that we can get back into the clinic, we can really hone up and quickly get onto that activity? So they're probably some of the things that we're doing within our group at the moment to think about how to manage that situation.
That's fantastic. And Camille's put a question on the chat, which I think is a great follow-up question, which could go to you, Afa, and others on the panel, which is, do you think it's best when applying for extensions that we give ourselves as much space as possible, for example, asking for a year rather than 6 months? I've been thinking about this. I've got to write to a funder in the next probably week to ask for an extension. And I sort of feel it's that negotiation thing of feeling a bit nervous to ask for anything more than the literal, you know, extra 3 months or something that COVID impacted. So I'm interested, do any of you have thoughts about how long you can go? And the other thing that I'm thinking, and perhaps Liz might have a comment on this, is for those of us where there were sort of also these perhaps less tangible impacts on productivity, like small children or school-aged kids at home, to what extent do you build that in, or is it okay to build that in extensions and conversations with funders? So I don't mind who wants to pick that one up.
I could quickly speak to that. I just had to do that this morning. You know, how long do you ask for? And then I was adding in months, and then I kept adding in more months. Then I'm like, oh, that stage. One thing that I've noticed about working in the university at the moment is everything takes longer. So invoicing for a project, buying a piece of equipment, every single administrative task takes longer because everyone's in their own houses. Money's too tight to mention. So I'm just I always have what I call a FAT factor, which is insert rude word around time, faff around time. And I have a FAT time attached to every project of 30%. And in COVID times, I've doubled my FAT time. And I just use that as a calculation. So I think, yeah, if you're thinking 6 months, think a year. The other thing I would say, just sort of building on something that one of the other presenters said, is that managing expectations is key to being a professional project deliverer. And I think you have to manage other people's expectations, but also your own of yourself, which other people have mentioned too. And so it's helpful, I think, to have a list of sort of housekeeping activities that are easy to do, that you can default to, and you can still feel like you're productive in these difficult times. So I have this little bucket in my task manager called future focus or maybe later. And sometimes I just sort of scope in there for things that I can do to occupy my time and feel like I'm being useful when I can't focus. But anyway, I'll be quiet.
Can I just add to that just very briefly, Ursula? I think the issue of time, you kind of have to find the balance. You don't want to, you know, everybody's asking for extensions, and the universities are in fact advocating on our behalves as well for, you know, the major funding bodies. But I think it is important to be able to justify why you need the extra time, and, you know, particularly if you're in a clinical setting and you haven't been able to even start recruitment because ethics committees are not even reviewing applications that are starting new projects, and our universities have said we're not supporting any new projects other than COVID ones for the moment, then you've got a real, very legitimate reason to go back to the funding body and say, you know, it's probably 4 months before we can even contemplate starting this particular phase of the research. We estimated it would take 12 months to recruit, and hence we need X, Y, Z. So I think if you can, it really depends on the project itself and on the grant itself as to how much. But I think justify as much as possible and add in the little bit of fluff, you know, the fluff factor, let's just call it that, as Inga has indicated, that you do need to build in a little bit of fat as well.
Yeah.
Ursula, can I just add one other thing? One of the things you mentioned was whether to mention your personal circumstances as well. I think people have different approaches to this, but one thing I wondered about was, I probably wouldn't share my personal experiences, particularly if it was a project grant. So where you've got a team of people and you're employing people to deliver various bits, it might feel a little bit too personal for me, but I'd be interested in other people's thoughts. But if it's for your fellowship or for a PhD scholarship that's directly about you and your track record and your performance, then I would be more inclined to say I was unable to work full time from the 1st of March until the 1st of June because my children were home. But I'd make it more about not it was exhausting for me to have the kids at home, but more I was unable to work full time, or I was only able to work 0.5 for this 6 months. But I feel like that's easier to justify in a personal, like a fellowship or a scholarship, than it might be for a project grant. I'd be interested if people want to add in their thoughts about that in the chat.
So I might jump onto that. Look, I'm on the ARC College of Experts, and I'm on promotion, the Level C Promotions Committee, which we just had last week. So for that, we have actually already had to deal with COVID disruptions. And I think my answer about adding personal information is, if you don't provide the information, the panel cannot take it into account. You know, we commented that almost everyone in one department commented on the amount of extra work they had to do from COVID-19 except one. And we said, why did this person not do it? Now, likelihood is that that person did indeed have to do the online transitioning, have to deal with the situation. They just didn't tell us. And it's not the panel's job to make those assumptions. So I think it's really important to provide the information and to provide the context, because we know that not everyone is affected equally in this situation, as Ursula said before. And so I think panelists need to know what information they need to know. I think to Claire's point, you know, if you're in a small team on a project grant, it may be appropriate to comment in case your relative to opportunity is going to be assessed more harshly than it should be. Look, as I said, no ARC panel that I've been on yet has had to deal with these disruptions, but the ARC College of Experts is very good at taking into account relative to opportunity. And so any information that the panel is given will be taken well. Everyone the world over knows that there's going to be 6 months disruption as a result of COVID-19, but it's helpful to put some explanation of the specific interruptions. And I think Claire's suggestion of, you know, for 3 months, I was only able to work 50% of the time due to childcare responsibilities is a helpful one, to actually enumerate the challenges that were caused because of it.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thanks, Liz. And yeah, I haven't applied for ARC before, but I have heard they've got quite helpful and also clear guidelines around how you calculate that sort of relative to opportunity and the different aspects there. So that's great. A question that's come up on the chat, which might be worth us considering, is Anne's asked about, I suppose, advice for graduating PhD students in the job market. So I might expand this question out, if I can, to also postdocs on fellowship, or who might be coming off fellowships and hope, you know, where funding is insecure and soft and those kinds of things. I suppose, I guess none of us knows really what the funding situation in the job market's going to look like over the next 6 to 12 months.
I might know more than most people.
Yeah, but exactly. Yeah. Would you like to speak to that a bit more, Inga?
It's terrible, awful, bad. And it's awful this year, it'll be terrible next year, it'll be worse the year after. This is a slow burning crisis. If we get our international students back next year, the best case scenario is 21,000 lost jobs in the sector. Now, how and when those people will be hired back, we don't know. We do know that casualisation has been a trend, and it will just continue to be a trend because this induces such an air of uncertainty. 38% of our research is funded via international student income. So that means any money that the university, other than competitive grants, is funneling into the sector will be cut dramatically. I'm sorry, I can't sugarcoat it. I think that anyone contemplating a career in academia really needs to seriously think about whether they stay or leave. My advice at the moment would be leave if you can. Psychologists have an amazing set of skills. My research shows that there's so many opportunities in the job market for your particular area. You are well set up compared to other places. I would also add that a lot of people sort of fear leaving and not being able to come back. I think we've experienced such an era of disruption that movement out and in will be up for grabs. So I think if you left now and you got some industry experience and you went and did a whole lot of other things, I don't think that closes the door on academia at all at this point, because they're just really, what is realistically going to happen is people applying for postdocs may be competing with people with decades of experience who find themselves out of work. So I say different things to different audiences. This particular audience, I think you're unique in the skills that you can offer outside academia and your ability to move between. So I would say look for every opportunity. Sorry to be a Debbie Downer. Apologies.
Okay, I'm going to jump in so that I don't lose half my staff overnight, because I think it's important to acknowledge that not everyone who's working in this space is a practicing psychologist. So, you know, like, for example, if I think about the people that I work with, they're not like Ursula or Claire, for example, who can have a practice aside from the research aspect. So, look, I think it is a difficult situation.
Sorry, I must clarify that.
Yeah.
I'm talking about the kind of skill sets that you use in your research, not your classification as a psychologist.
I think look, I think it's going to be quite difficult for funding, but I would like to think that there will continue to be some opportunities which will be more limited, but trying to use this time to be as productive as possible and make yourself as saleable as possible for, you know, what the future brings, I think is an important priority, particularly where people don't necessarily see a different path that's easily accessible for them at the moment. So, you know, I think it's challenging, but I'd like to not be super negative, so that, you know, we're trying to think of how do you make the most of a situation that you've got at the moment, which for some people might be, I'm going to step away from this for a couple of years and then come back, you know, hopefully when things settle down. Or it might be I'm going to focus my energies on X, Y, Z, which will make me a bit more better set up for when things start to look a little bit different.
Yeah, and you know, I want to thank you both, because I think that in a way that the two views are things that ECRs, you know, grapple with all the time, and there's certainly things that I've thought about, you know, with the end of a fellowship looming. And so I guess one of the things I can see Inga's written on the chat, you know, about the sort of skill sets that you have as someone with a PhD potentially in psychology and those sorts of things, and that's really true. One of the things that I've wondered about, you know, if it ever came, you know, if I ever needed to activate my plan B or my plan C or whichever and move out of academia, is how do you I guess, you know, which skills are important, but more importantly, how do you kind of keep working on those skills in metrics that are meaningful beyond academia, I suppose, because we're used to kind of performing for certain metrics that count when you're going for positions in academia, like publications and all of this sort of thing. But I think it could be helpful for early career researchers in this space, not necessarily to be having one foot out the door, but I guess having a flexible ability to think about the strong skills that you have now and how that positions you well within academia, but also how you would then be able to kind of frame that to make you also competitive outside of academia. Do you have comments on that, Inga, in terms of how you suddenly switched to having an industry competitive CV?
I could bore for Australia on the topic, so I won't. And I realise that I've really introduced, it's like a fart in an elevator right now. I've really introduced a very controversial, and I say this around my colleagues here at ANU, and I just think we can't sugarcoat the situation. It's deadly serious. And I think there's a lot of magical thinking that's been able to happen in PhD. I did it myself when I was doing my PhD, like jobs, another question, I'll think about that next year, Well, unfortunately, this reality is with us and it's really present. So a couple of thoughts. I've been furiously writing blog posts about this. My last two have very concrete advice. I think the best way I can distill it is start acting like you haven't got an academic career ahead of you. So what does that look like? What that looks like is, where's my opportunity space? In LinkedIn, who do I know who's got a similar career profile as me who has left? What are they doing now? Go talk to them. if I want to be writing, is such a critical skill that employers ask for. So amazing. And in your area, I would say, again, leaving aside the psychologist designation or not, I understand the peculiarities around that. But you write about statistics, you write about quantitative methods, you've got clear methods of writing. And I think these are huge career assets. Being able to look at data, not be afraid of it, look at quantitative data and be able to write about it is what we see in so many job ads. I've analysed 1.4 million of them with machine learning processing. But not only that, I had to read thousands of them, and I just see that writing thing come up. But it's not the writing in the kind of florid academic style. It's learning to write reports, memos, influential papers, helping people learn about data and learn about findings and implications. So identifying those user groups that are interested in your research, reaching out to them, providing presentations, writing for them. These build a portfolio of engagement, and you never know who you might meet through that activity. I could go on and on and on. I think that we really have to be realistic that we just don't know what the outcome of this disruption will be. But my prediction is that it's already 50% of people leave academia on completion of a PhD. It's already normal not to go on. Okay, so it'll just become very normal not to go on. And that means that when academia does recover, and I hope that it will, I expect that it will, all the indications are looking good. We've got logistical problems of getting 350,000 people into the country through quarantine next year. But if we can overcome that, we can almost go back to normal. I'm hopeful. So there's a lot of questions that I have. I think I lost my train of thought there because I got ranty. So maybe I'll die down. But, I just think that if you just act like my next job is not going to be an academic job, then, and apply that to everything that you do. And I'm sorry to my fellow researchers, this means we want you to keep writing journal papers, but is that a best use of your time? I would deeply question it. Or is it better to go and, analyse the job market potential for yourself and start writing other things? That's the question I would leave you with. I think this kind of time does breed a certain element of selfishness, and right now I'd say lean into it. Anyway. Yeah. I'm just here to be controversial today, clearly.
It's good.
My role.
It's really good. And like, honestly, I think that there would be many ECRs who are competing for small pots of funding and for uncertain fellowships that are just insanely competitive, who have had those thoughts, whether it's 3 a.m. in the morning or whatever, just kind of thinking like, what is the plan B? So I think it's actually helpful to acknowledge that there is that reality and actually turn that into something constructive where we can go, okay, and then how do I take steps to prepare myself for that? So that's really helpful. I think that we might open it up in case there are some more questions. So I'll hand over to Camille to just facilitate any further questions that might come from our attendees. Attendees, please feel free to shoot your questions through the chat or I don't know if they can turn on their microphones, or if that's something we need to do, Bonnie, but we'd love to hear your questions if anyone has any further questions about the what next after today.
There has been one kind of follow-up in terms of coming back to academia later on. So definitely, I think, I know my uni at least, there is a lot of intention to connect more with industry and to do more practical research. Does the panel think that those trends will make it easier for people to come back from industry and other experiences without having the kind of traditional metrics like papers, because those skills will be more valued? Or do you think it will remain the same?
Really hard to say. I would love to say that they'll be so desperate to get you back that they'll be accepting anything, and that you actually probably won't want to come back, is my prediction. So when we talk to people who have transitioned out with the kind of skills that you've got, the pay is better, the working conditions are better, their work is interesting. In my dreams, I see academia begging you to come back, and then having to let go of those certain assumptions about, conventional academic capital. That's my hope and dream.
Look, I think we are, sorry, can I just
No,
add
you
to that?
go.
I think we are seeing examples of isolated cases of people who go out into industry, get amazing experience and connections, and are able to then come back and establish really successful academic careers. So it certainly happens, and that shows that they weren't judged, their track records weren't judged in fellowship applications and grant applications. It unfortunately is a bit more an exception than a rule at the moment, but I think we need to take that and to say, you know, things, it can certainly happen. We need to be encouraged, and you know, it's so easy to say, oh, you can never leave and come back again. But I think things are changing, and we can certainly point to examples where it has happened.
Does anyone else have any comments on that?
I was just going to add that I hire a lot of people, maybe not in the next 12 months, but have in the past. And I always see it as a real benefit if I see that people on their CV have worked particularly for one of my partners or someone who's funded me in the past, because I feel like it just gives you this really amazing insight into how they operate. So I see those people as like insiders that I desperately want in my team when they consider coming back. So certainly I see it as a strength to have had 2 to 4 years out of academia and in another field. And I certainly welcome them back and help them to get back on the academic track if that's what they'd like to do.
That's really progressive and forward thinking of you, Claire, and I think the best researchers do that, because increasingly the government is making us search for funding from industry, and from these kind of other sources. Linkage grants are just but the tip of the iceberg of what's possible there. And I think what a ECR leaving needs to understand is that your knowledge of how the university works, particularly how funding works, is extremely valuable. A friend of mine, for instance, is a knowledge broker, and he works in large engineering companies, gets paid the mozza, and his sole responsibility is to broker research projects with universities and the company. That's all he does all day, is think up ideas, go around to a whole bunch of researchers and say, do you want to do this together? And then because he knows how the university works, he creates that linkage. And universities have been trying to hire him back for years because, you know, he's really valuable. He can turn his knowledge of both areas. So I'd see this becoming more common. I actually think it's a horribly positive thing that it's forced us into, that those industry connections will be highly valued. So I'd encourage you to seek them out now. Why wait? APR intern has, you know, internships you can do that are paid. There's all sorts of opportunities to just go out there and already get started.
Okay, thank you. We have a question for our ECR members of the panel. So Ursula and Gemma and myself, I guess. What's the one thing universities or your own institutions could do to better support you? Ursula.
I saw that and I was just thinking, gosh, I think I've got a fellowship that ends, you know, sometime a weird time next year. And so I think, you know, honestly, getting more funding for my salary is a thing that really looms large in my mind at the moment. And I'm quite concerned that in the wake of COVID-19, the sort of the bridging sorts of one-year fellowships that they tended to usually have for fellows and things like that, if you know, don't have a fellowship, that they'll kind of disappear. Other sources of funding, like particular pots of funding that they had for women after maternity leave, those kind of disappeared for a little while and then they were given back. And but just thinking about Inga's point, I just also do wonder whether in this new world where things are needing to be restructured and redesigned, you know, whether there couldn't also be more opportunities for universities to partner with not just industry, but actually partner with like the clinical sector. So for myself, I'm 0.6 research, 0.4 clinical. And it would be so great to have, you know, research positions funded in universities that enabled ECRs to spend part of their time in industry or spend part of their time in clinical spaces, building up their CV and connections in both areas. It would be lower cost for the unis. It would also be more valuable for both parties. So I would love something innovative like that to be developed. I don't know how likely that is, but I guess it all comes down to funding though for me, Ben. So.
Thanks, Ursula. Gemma, I will hear from you, and then I think it'll be time to wrap everything up.
Sure. I have to say most of what I had been thinking about with this is similar to Ursula, and I think probably is similar to a lot of people, where early career in particular tend to be on shorter term contracts. You know, looking at when my contract ends and what skills I potentially need to go into a different career path or continue in this one. I think coming back to one of the tips that was given at the beginning of the webinar, my university has actually been excellent in the communication aspect, and I've found it really helpful to be able to talk to more senior people about this. And I found that the question that they tend to ask me is, okay, well, what do you think you need for your career? And I think it's a really good question to reflect on, of what you particularly want to do, maybe what you want to upskill in, what you've currently got on your plate, but also what is going to benefit you in particular. So I think it's great that I've been able to have those conversations, but I do also think that, like Ursula said, it'd be great to see universities on the whole more collaboratively maybe trying to help ECRs develop some of these skills. So whether it's training for some of the things that would help us develop our CVs in a slightly different way. I think we're in a bit of uncharted waters here, and although I'm finding lots of support from different places, I think it'd be useful for universities to maybe look at it as a more cohesive kind of, what can we do across the board? So I don't know whether that's through particular organisations that are targeted at early career researchers or universities overall. I'm not sure, but I guess that's what I would like to see a bit more.
Thank you, Gemma, and thank you to all of our panelists. I would like to hand it back to Ursula to wrap up and spur us on to keep thinking about these things.
Yeah, thank you so much. I won't spend long because I know all of us have back-to-back Zoom calls and Teams calls these days, but I just want to reiterate how grateful we are to each of our panelists, Afagogus, Liz New, Inga Mewburn, and Claire Wakefield, really for your time and wisdom. These are really tricky times, and I'm glad that we kind of went to some of the difficult places today, because these are the things that we need to grapple with. But I really feel that we've had some really productive and practical tips today of ways to move forward. And in terms of next steps, for anyone on the line who's not already engaged with the PoCoG ECR Special Interest Group, please reach out to us, you know, separately or together later on. Please continue the discussion on Twitter later on, the hashtags in the chat, and we're going to be continuing to organise events, whether they be Twitter events or online events that meet our collective needs over the next year. So please get in touch with any ideas and requests that you might have around that as well, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Ursula and team. It was great to
Yeah.
have the opportunity.
Thanks so much for doing all the
Thanks.
organising.
Yeah, you did a great
See
job.
you.
Thank
Good luck.
you.
Bye.
Bye.